Greetings, traveler of the seas. Tonight, I'll be your compass on a journey through waters few have ever charted. What I'm about to share doesn't appear in Morgan's newspapers, nor in the Navy's records. It's a story the ocean kept safe, tucked away from the world's gaze. They speak of a name, Franky, also known as the Cyborg Carpenter. I see you've come this far with salt in your eyes, and the wind still clinging to your coat, perhaps from distant shores, or memories not easily forgotten. Are you tired? Lost between dreams, left unfinished, and longings that still echo in your heart? Come, sit here with me by the fire. The flames are low and calm, almost whispering stories to those willing to listen. Let the warmth hold you, and the silence of the night cradle your thoughts. There's no rush here, no danger, just stories, not the kind you read in a hurry, but the kind you feel slowly, with your soul. Each word is a candle lit within, each silence a soft breath between stars. Let's sail to islands that only appear when we close our eyes, where the laughter of old pirates still lingers, and where secrets sleep quietly beneath the sea. All set? Take a deep breath. Let go of the helm of reality, and let my voice carry you somewhere new. The journey begins now, and maybe, by the end of it, you'll discover something meaningful about yourself. The workshop aboard the Thousand Sunny was quiet, save for the soft tapping of metal against metal. It was late, the kind of late that blurs into early, but Franky couldn't sleep. His large hands, meticulously designed by his own genius, worked almost independently of thought as he tinkered with a small mechanical bird. "Almost there, little guy," he murmured, adjusting a tiny gear with surprising gentleness for fingers so massive. The lantern hanging overhead cast warm light across his workspace, illuminating scattered blueprints, tools arranged with methodical care, and the numerous half-finished inventions that populated every available surface. This room was his sanctuary, a place where metal and wood became extensions of imagination. Franky paused, examining his handiwork. The mechanical bird was a whim, not necessary for the ship, not a weapon or tool, just something beautiful he wanted to create. He wound the small key in its back, and with a soft whirring, the bird's wings began to flutter. It rose shakily into the air, circled the workshop once, then settled on his shoulder with a delicate chirp. "Super," he whispered, a gentler version of his usual exuberant approval. "Have you ever noticed how your hands remember things your mind has forgotten? The way they move, almost on their own, carrying the memory of every skill you've ever learned." Franky looked down at his massive palms. Metal and flesh merged into something new. These hands had built and destroyed. They had torn apart ships and lovingly crafted the Thousand Sunny. They had struck friends in confusion and embraced them in loyalty. His fingers traced a pattern on the workbench, the same dimensions as the first toy boat he'd ever built as a child in Water 7. He hadn't consciously recalled that vessel in years, yet his hands remembered its exact proportions. "Tom," he said softly to the empty room, "you would have loved this ship." Tom's workers, the found family of his youth. Tom with his booming laugh and boundless wisdom. Iceberg with his serious face, hiding a caring heart. Kokoro with her gruff affection. They had taught him not just how to build ships, but why ships mattered. They were more than wood and nails, more than transportation. They were dreams given form, freedom made tangible. The mechanical bird chirped again, nuzzling against his cheek. Franky smiled, remembering how Tom would often say that a good shipwright puts a piece of his soul into every vessel he creates. What parts of your soul have you embedded in the things you've built? What pieces of yourself live on in your creations? Outside the workshop window, the ocean stretched endless and dark, punctuated only by starlight. The Sunny rocked gently, a rhythm as familiar to Franky as his own heartbeat. He'd built her to withstand anything, storms, sea kings, navy attacks, but also to carry her crew gently when they needed rest. A good ship knows when to be strong and when to be gentle. Tom had taught him. Just like a good man, Franky had spent years rebuilding himself after the sea train accident, replacing flesh with steel, bone with gears, becoming something neither fully human nor fully machine. Sometimes he wondered which parts of himself had been lost in that transformation and which parts had been found. His hand unconsciously moved to his chest, where underneath metal plating beat a heart still made of flesh. The dividing line between man and machine wasn't as clear as others might think. He was both and neither, and somehow more than the sum of his parts. The bird chirped once more before winding down, its mechanical wings folding neatly against its body. Franky carefully placed it on the workbench, making a mental note to show it to Chopper in the morning. The little doctor would be delighted. He stretched, metal joints creaking slightly. Despite rebuilding himself multiple times, adding weapons and features that defied conventional human limitations, he had kept this one vulnerability, the need for rest. Perhaps because sleep connected him to his humanity in ways his cyborg body sometimes made him forget. As he prepared to leave the workshop, Franky's eyes fell on a small wooden figurine tucked away on a high shelf, a carving of the Going Merry he'd made after joining the crew, a memorial of sorts to a ship he'd never sailed on, but whose spirit he'd felt the moment he stepped aboard the Sunny. "Ships have souls," he murmured, echoing Tom's wisdom, "and sometimes they remember what we forget. And what about you? What do your hands remember that your mind has filed away? What skills live in your fingers, waiting to be rediscovered?" Franky dimmed the lantern and closed the workshop door quietly behind him. Tomorrow would bring new adventures, new challenges for his shipwright's hands to solve. But for now, in the quiet hours when the boundary between one day and the next blurred like the horizon at sunset, he carried with him the simple satisfaction of creation, of bringing something new to the world that hadn't existed before. This, more than his superhuman strength or weaponized body, was the true power in his hands, the power to build, to create, to transform raw material into something with purpose and sometimes even beauty. Morning arrived in gentle increments, first as a subtle shift in the darkness, then as pale golden light filtering through the workshop window. Franky had fallen asleep at his workbench, head resting on folded arms, surrounded by tools and blueprints. He woke to the sound of the ship coming alive around him, distant footsteps on the deck above, Sanji's movements in the galley, Luffy's unmistakable laughter carrying through the wooden walls. For a moment, Franky remained still, listening to the symphony of his nakama beginning their day. There was something profoundly satisfying about knowing his creation. This ship, the Thousand Sunny, held them all safely as they pursued their dreams across unpredictable seas. He stood, stretching arms that could extend far beyond normal human reach, feeling the complex machinery of his body awaken. With methodical care, he opened a small compartment in his left forearm and checked the cola level, still sufficient, though he'd need to refill soon. Cola, such an ordinary drink, yet it powered extraordinary functions. Franky smiled at the incongruity. So much of his life existed in these spaces between the mundane and the marvelous. Have you ever considered how much of who you are exists in such in-between spaces? Not fully one thing or another, but something uniquely your own? Franky ran a diagnostic check on his systems, a morning ritual, as essential to him as coffee was to others. His mind drifted to Water 7, to the shipyard, where he'd first rebuilt himself. He'd been angry then, bitter about the loss of his human body, determined to transform his pain into power. He examined his metal hand, opening and closing it slowly. Funny how things change, he murmured. What had begun as an act of survival, rebuilding his broken body with whatever was available, had evolved into something else entirely. Not just a way to stay alive, but a form of self-expression. With each modification, each improvement, he wasn't just repairing damage, but reimagining possibility. The mechanical bird from last night sat on his workbench. Franky activated it again, watching as it took flight, circling the workshop before landing on his shoulder. Such a small thing, with no practical purpose beyond beauty and companionship. Yet he'd spent hours perfecting its wings, its balance, the soft chirping sound it made. You know what, little guy, he said to the bird. Sometimes the most super things we build aren't the biggest or strongest. Footsteps approached his workshop door, followed by a gentle knock. Franky, are you awake? Usopp's voice. Sanji says breakfast is ready. Be right there, bro, Franky called back, his volume automatically shifting to his more energetic public persona. Interesting how he, too, had different modes. Quiet introspection in solitude, exuberant enthusiasm with others. Which was more authentic? Perhaps both. Perhaps authenticity wasn't about consistency, but about wholeness, embracing all the seemingly contradictory parts that made him who he was. What parts of yourself do you show the world, and what parts remain known only to you? Franky gathered himself, placed the mechanical bird carefully on a shelf, and headed to the galley. The familiar chaos of breakfast greeted him. Luffy, attempting to steal food from everyone's plates, Sanji simultaneously serving the ladies with flourish and kicking Luffy away from the food, Zoro and Sanji bickering over something inconsequential, Nami trying to maintain order. Super morning, everyone, Franky announced, striking his signature pose, arms together overhead. He took his place at the table, accepting the plate. Sanji slid his way with a nod of thanks. These meals together, the noise, the laughter, the occasional food fight, had become as much a part of him as the metal components he'd built into his body. Franky, that new cannon adjustment is working perfectly, Usopp said between bites. The targeting system is so much more precise now. Told you it would be, Franky replied with pride. Added a gyroscopic stabilizer that compensates for the ship's movement. Can you make something that compensates for Luffy's appetite? Nami asked dryly, as their captain somehow managed to stretch an arm around 3 people to snatch a piece of bacon. The conversation flowed around him, and Franky participated with his usual enthusiasm. Yet part of him remained in the quiet space of the workshop, thinking about identity, how it was both something we build ourselves and something built in relation to others. Before Tom's workers, he'd been Cuttyflam, a name he rarely used now, though it remained a part of him, like the few original human organs still functioning within his mechanical frame. After the accident, he'd become Franky, reinventing himself along with his body, and now, aboard the Sunny, he was something else again. Shipwright, protector, Nakama. We are all, in our way, architects of ourselves, designing and building who we become through choices both momentous and minute. After breakfast, as the crew dispersed to their various duties, Franky returned to the open deck. The morning sun glinted off his metal arms as he surveyed his creation, the ship that carried them all toward their dreams. From keel to crow's nest, he knew every plank, every nail, every mechanism. He had designed her to be an extension of himself in many ways, resilient, adaptable, capable of both tremendous power and gentle nurturing. A ship is only as good as the dreams it carries, Tom had told him once, looking around at his nakama going about their day, Nami charting their course, Zoro training with impossible weights, Robin reading peacefully under the shade of her tangerine trees. Luffy perched on his special seat at the figurehead. Franky felt a swell of pride, not just in the vessel he'd created, but in the dreams it held. And what of your own vessel, the body and life you inhabit? What dreams does it carry, and how have you designed it to weather both storm and calm? The afternoon sun beat down on the Thousand Sunnies deck, where Franky and Zoro had cleared a space for sparring. Though not a regular practice for the shipwright, these occasional sessions helped him test modifications to his cyborg body under controlled condition. "Ready when you are, bro," Franky called, shifting into a defensive stance. Zoro nodded, drawing only one sword, a concession to the friendly nature of their match. Still, Franky knew better than to underestimate the swordsman, even at a fraction of his full capability. The first exchange was swift, metal arm meeting, steel blade, with a resonant clang that echoed across the deck. Franky felt the impact reverberate through his frame, data points automatically registering in his cybernetic systems. Force applied, structural integrity, response time. Yet beyond the metrics and measurements, there was something elemental about the exchange. The age-old dance of strength against strength, will against will. Nearby, Luffy and Usopp had paused their fishing to watch, offering occasional commentary and encouragement. Robin observed quietly from her deck chair, book temporarily forgotten. Even Brook had stopped playing his violin to witness the friendly match. "Your left side's still dropping when you block overhead," Zoro commented between exchanges, his observation offered without judgment, one fighter to another. Franky nodded, making the adjustment. "Good catch. Shoulder joint needs recalibration." They continued, moving across the deck in a choreography of attack and defense. Despite his massive frame and mechanical enhancements, Franky had worked to maintain a certain fluidity of movement, strength without stiffness, power with precision. Have you ever noticed how true strength isn't always about how hard you can hit, but sometimes about how well you can move? After 20 minutes, both fighters were showing signs of exertion. Zoro's breathing deeper, a thin sheen of sweat on his brow. Franky's cooling systems working harder, the faint whir of internal fans audible in moments of stillness. "Let's call it," Zoro suggested, sheathing his sword. "Good session." Franky nodded, performing a quick systems check as his combat protocols powered down. "Super workout. My calibration data is all updated now." As the small audience dispersed, Franky remained on deck, looking out at the ocean. The sparring match had him thinking about strength, its different forms, its purpose, its limitations. For years after losing Tom, strength had been his obsession, rebuilding his body to be stronger, tougher, more resilient, as if enough physical power could somehow protect him from ever feeling that kind of loss again. Yet Luffy, with his rubber body that looked almost fragile compared to Franky's metal frame, possessed a different kind of strength altogether, one that came not from physical enhancements, but from unshakable conviction. "Penny for your thoughts?" Robin's voice interrupted his musings as she approached, book tucked under her arm. "Just thinking about strength," Franky admitted. "All the different kinds." Robin nodded, her perceptive eyes seeming to understand more than he'd said. "You've rebuilt yourself many times, haven't you? Each time stronger than before." "Yeah, but..." He paused, formulating the thought. "I'm starting to think maybe the strongest parts aren't the metal ones. What strengths do you possess that can't be measured? What powers live in your heart rather than your hands?" Robin smiled slightly. "The strongest material Tom used in building his ships wasn't wood or metal. His heart," Franky finished. "That's what he always said." They stood in companionable silence, watching the waves. Franky thought about Tom's legacy, not just the ships he'd built, including Roger's Oro Jackson, but the lessons he'd imparted, the love he'd shown to an orphaned boy with blue hair and a talent for mechanics. Tom had been physically strong, certainly able to lift massive timbers single-handedly, but his greater strength had been his unwavering conviction, his ability to laugh in the face of adversity, his courage to build what others deemed forbidden. Sometimes I wonder, Franky said softly, if I'm using my strength the way Tom would have wanted. And what conclusion do you reach? Robin asked. Franky looked around at the Sunny, at the ship he'd built to carry his Nakama safely through the world's most dangerous seas. I think he'd be proud, not because of how strong I made myself, but because of what I used that strength for. Robin nodded. The measure of strength isn't in its magnitude, but in its purpose. The conversation shifted to other topics, upcoming islands on their journey, modifications Franky was planning for the ship's systems, a book Robin had discovered in her library about ancient shipbuilding techniques. But as the afternoon waned, Franky's thoughts returned to strength and its many forms, the visible strength of his metallic arms and weaponized body, the invisible strength of his knowledge, creativity, and resolve, the collective strength of the Straw Hat crew, each member bringing different abilities but united in purpose, and perhaps the most important strength of all, the courage to be vulnerable sometimes, to acknowledge that even a body of steel housed a heart that could be wounded, that could feel loss and fear and longing. Isn't it curious how our greatest strengths often emerge from what we once perceived as weaknesses? As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Franky made his way to the figurehead, where Luffy sat in his special spot, legs dangling over the edge, face turned toward the wind. Hey, Captain, Franky said, joining him. Mind some company? Luffy grinned. Nope. Looking for something? Franky shook his head. Just thinking about where we're headed, both the next island and everything after. Laugh, Tail, Luffy said, his voice unusually quiet, but filled with certainty. The One Piece, becoming Pirate King. Yeah, Franky looked at his captain, this young man, whose physical form seemed so unimposing, yet who carried such immense dreams. You ever doubt we'll make it? Luffy's answer was immediate and absolute. Never. And there it was, perhaps the purest form of strength, not muscles or metal or modifications, but unshakable belief, the kind of strength that moved others, that created ripples across the world, that changed the course of history. What do you believe in with such certainty? What conviction gives strength to your journey? The evening settled over the Thousand Sunny like a gentle blanket, stars appearing one by one in the darkening sky. After dinner, while most of the crew gathered in the aquarium bar for Brooks' impromptu concert, Franky returned to his workshop with a specific purpose in mind. From a locked drawer in his workbench, he removed a weathered roll of blueprints, not for a weapon or ship component, but for something more personal. He spread the papers carefully across the table, weighing the corners with small tools. Staring back at him were the original designs for his cyborg body, the desperate, hurried sketches he'd made while floating among the wreckage of Tom's dismantled ships. The blueprints were stained with seawater and blood, the lines sometimes shaky, reflecting the pain and anger that had guided his hand. Franky traced the faded lines with one massive finger, remembering he'd been so young then, so full of rage and grief. The modifications had been functional, but crude, designed for survival and vengeance, rather than any greater purpose. Have you ever looked back at something you created in a moment of pain and seen not just what it was, but what it has become? Beside these original plans, Franky placed newer blueprints, the revisions he'd made over years of refining his cybernetic body. Each iteration showed growth, not just in technical skill, but in purpose. The weapons became more precise, less destructive, the functionality more versatile, the design more harmonious, balancing human and machine rather than simply replacing one with the other. Memory is its own kind of blueprint, he murmured to himself, comparing the documents side by side. He remembered the day Tom was taken, the chaos, the betrayal, the moment he'd thrown himself in front of the sea train in desperate attempt to stop it. The pain had been unimaginable, his human body broken beyond natural repair. But pain, like everything else, had transformed with time, not disappeared. He would never forget Tom's voice, his laugh, the wisdom in his eyes, but changed from a sharp, cutting grief into something deeper and more complex, a foundation upon which other experiences could be built. What memories have shaped your blueprint? Which ones still guide how you construct your days? Franky carefully rolled up the old blueprints, returning them to their drawer. Unlike some of his crewmates who carried photographs or keepsakes of loved ones, these technical drawings were his most precious mementos, the tangible record of his journey from Cuddy Flam to Franky, from human to cyborg, from orphaned apprentice to straw hat shipwright. He closed his eyes, visualizing Water 7, the rising tiers of the city, the flowing canals, the distinctive silhouette of Dock 1, where he'd spent his childhood. Though he hadn't seen it in years, he could still draw every street from memory, could still hear the particular sound water made as it moved through the city's channels. Home, a place he'd both loved and left behind. A soft knock at the workshop door interrupted his reverie. "Come in," he called, quickly wiping unexpected moisture from his eyes. The door opened to reveal Chopper, the little doctor, clutching a small tool in his hooves. "Sorry to bother you, Franky," he said shyly, "but I found this on deck and thought it might be important." Franky recognized the specialized wrench he used for fine adjustments to his smaller components. "Thanks, little bro." Was wondering where that went. Chopper beamed at being helpful, then noticed the blueprints still visible on the workbench. "Are you designing something new?" "Nah, just reviewing some old plans. Memory lane stuff." Chopper nodded with surprising understanding. "I do that sometimes, with Dr. Hiraluk's medical journals, even though I know them by heart now." The innocent comment touched something in Franky. Here was another who understood what it meant to carry someone's legacy, to hold the blueprint of memory and build upon it with your own hands. "Want to see something cool?" Franky asked suddenly. At Chopper's eager nod, he opened a different drawer and removed a small mechanical toy, a tiny duck that could waddle and quack. "Tom made this for me when I was a kid. One of the first things that made me want to build stuff myself." Chopper's eyes widened with delight as Franky wound the key and set the duck walking across the workbench. "It's amazing, and it still works after all this time. Tom always said a well-made thing outlives its maker," Franky replied, watching the toy with a mixture of nostalgia and pride. Guess he was right. They spent the next hour together, Franky showing Chopper various inventions from different periods of his life, each one a marker of where he'd been, what he'd learned, who he'd become. The doctor listened with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions that revealed his own inventor's heart. And isn't that how memory best serves us? Not as a locked room we visit alone, but as a blueprint we share, allowing others to understand the structure of our experience. Later, after Chopper had left for bed, Franky remained in his workshop, contemplating the nature of legacy. Tom lived on, not just in the ships he'd built or the techniques he'd taught, but in how Franky approached his own craft with passion, integrity, and joy. Water 7 remained part of him, not as a place he needed to return to, but as the foundation upon which he'd built his journey. We carry our beginnings with us always, not as burdens, but as bearings, points by which to navigate the seas of becoming. as sleep finally began to claim him. Frankie wondered about your own blueprints, the memories that had shaped you, the places that had formed you, the people whose wisdom still guided your hands. What structures had you built upon these foundations? What legacy were you crafting with each passing day? The workshop lamp dimmed, casting long shadows across blueprints both old and new, as the Thousand Sunny carried her sleeping crew through gentle waters beneath a canopy of stars. Dawn painted the horizon in hues of promise as Frankie emerged from his workshop, stretching mechanical arms toward the sky. He'd slept little, absorbed in a new project that had seized his imagination during the night, a miniature version of the Thousand Sunny, designed as a music box for Brooke's upcoming birthday. The deck was quiet this early, occupied only by Jinbei at the helm and Robin reading in her usual spot. The fishman nodded a greeting as Frankie approached, blue eyes taking in the shipwright's appearance. "Another all-night session?" Jinbei asked, his deep voice carrying a note of friendly concern. Frankie grinned. "Creative flow, bro. Couldn't stop once the idea hit. I'll power down for maintenance later." He leaned against the railing, looking out at the ocean stretching endlessly before them. The morning light transformed the water's surface into something almost like metal, shifting, gleaming, alive with possibility. "Beautiful morning," Jinbei commented, his experienced hands making a slight adjustment to their course. Frankie nodded, appreciating how the helmsman understood both ship and sea, the vessel and the element it traveled through. "Ever miss the ocean?" he asked suddenly. "I mean, being in it instead of on it?" Jinbei considered this thoughtfully. Sometimes the sea feels different from within, more immediate, more encompassing. He glanced at Frankie. "Do you miss being fully human?" The question didn't offend Frankie. Coming from Jinbei, who knew something about existing between worlds, it felt like genuine curiosity rather than judgment. "Not really," he answered honestly. "Can't miss what I don't remember clearly anymore. This body's been mine longer than my original one ever was. Have you ever noticed how we adapt to new vessels, whether they're physical bodies, relationships, or life circumstances, until what once felt foreign becomes the most natural thing in the world? Besides," Frankie continued, patting the ship's railing affectionately, "if I'd stayed fully human, I couldn't have built the Sunny the way she is. Some dreams require transformation to achieve." Jinbei nodded, wisdom in his eyes. "The best vessels, ships, bodies, lives, are those shaped specifically for the dreams they carry." They fell silent, watching the sun climb higher above the horizon. From below deck came the first stirrings of the day. Sanji in the galley, the clatter of pots signaling breakfast preparations, Luffy's voice, already energetic despite the early hour, Usopp's footsteps heading toward the crow's nest to relieve Zoro from night watch. Frankie thought about vessels and their purposes. The Thousand Sunny, designed to carry the Straw Hats safely toward their dreams. His cyborg body, rebuilt to house his spirit and skills. Water 7, the city ship that had cradled his childhood. Each vessel serving its purpose, each one both container and enabler of the dreams within. "When I was rebuilding myself," Frankie said, "I focused on making a body that could do more, stronger, faster, weaponized, but I never considered changing the core stuff, the heart, the brain, the parts that make me who I am. Some vessels are meant to change," Jinbei replied. "Others serve us best by remaining constant. What vessels carry your dreams forward? Which ones have transformed, and which remain as anchors to who you've always been?" The conversation shifted to more practical matters. Navigation, weather patterns, an island Nami predicted they would reach by afternoon. Yet Frankie's mind continued exploring the concept of vessels and their contents. He remembered building his first real ship as part of Tom's workers, the pride he'd felt seeing something he helped create take to the water, carrying people safely from one shore to another. A vessel fulfilling its purpose was a beautiful thing. As the morning progressed and the crew fully awakened, Franky went about his shipwright duties, checking systems, making minor repairs, ensuring the Sunny remained worthy of the dreams she carried. Each task was both practical and profound, the routine maintenance that kept dreams afloat. Later, as they approached the island Nami had predicted, Franky stood at the bow, beside Luffy, both watching the shoreline emerge from the distance. "Hey, Franky," Luffy said suddenly. "If you could build any kind of ship in the world, what would it be?" The question caught him by surprise, not because it was profound, but because he'd never considered any ship beyond the Sunny. She was his masterpiece, the culmination of everything he'd learned from Tom, everything he'd discovered on his own. "Already built it, bro," he answered honestly. "The Sunny's the ship of my dreams." Luffy grinned, satisfied with this answer. "Good, because she's gonna carry me to become Pirate King." The simple confidence in his captain's voice made Franky smile. Luffy never doubted that his dreams would become reality, that the vessel Franky had created would prove worthy of the journey. And isn't that the ultimate purpose of any vessel? To be worthy of what it carries. As the island grew larger before them, Franky thought about all the vessels that had carried him to this point in his life. Some had been temporary, others permanent. Some had broken under pressure, others had revealed unexpected strength. All had shaped his journey in ways both obvious and subtle. His cybernetic body, the Thousand Sunny, the Straw Hat crew itself, a vessel of another kind, carrying each member's dreams within its collective journey. Perhaps the most important vessels were those that remained adaptable, strong enough to weather storms, yet flexible enough to change course when necessary, not unlike the blend of metal and humanity that composed his own unique frame. What vessels have carried you safely through storms? Which ones transformed along with you, and which provided stability when everything else changed? As the crew prepared to dock at the island, Franky performed one final check of the Sunny's systems. Each gear, each plank, each nail, all parts of the greater whole, all essential to the vessel's purpose. "You're doing super, girl," he murmured to the ship, patting her railing with affection. "Just keep carrying us forward, toward dreams still forming, shores yet unseen, possibilities still taking shape." In the workshop of imagination, the island had proven uneventful, a peaceful place to restock supplies and allow the log post to set. As evening approached, most of the crew remained ashore, enjoying the local tavern's hospitality. Franky had returned to the ship earlier, drawn by the siren call of a new idea that needed immediate attention. In his workshop, he carefully disassembled his left forearm, components laid out in precise order on his workbench. The modification he envisioned was subtle but significant, not another weapon or tool, but an improvement to the arm's tactile sensitivity. "Shipwright's hands need to feel the wood," he murmured to himself, adjusting minuscule sensors with specialized tools. Though his cyborg body gave him tremendous strength and capabilities beyond human limits, Franky had discovered that certain aspects of craftsmanship required a gentler touch, the ability to sense grain direction in wood, to feel the subtle differences in texture that revealed a material's quality. This balance between power and sensitivity had become a central theme in his ongoing self-modifications, not just becoming stronger, but becoming more nuanced, not just more durable, but more perceptive. Have you ever noticed how much of life happens in this delicate balance between strength and sensitivity, between the visible and invisible aspects of who we are? A knock at the workshop door interrupted his concentration. "It's open," he called, not looking up from his work. The door creaked open to reveal Brooke, the skeleton musician, ducking slightly to enter the space. "Pardon the intrusion, Franky-san," Brooke said politely. "I was hoping you might have a moment to look at my violin. The tuning peg seems to be sticking." "Sure thing, bro. Let me just..." Franky carefully secured the components he'd been working with, then turned his attention to Brooke. "Let's see what we've got." The skeleton handed over his precious instrument with the care one might show a newborn. Franky accepted it with equal reverence, his massive hands surprisingly delicate as he examined the problem. "Easy fix," he diagnosed after a moment. "Just needs a tiny bit of special oil I use for fine mechanical joints. Won't affect the sound at all." As he worked on the violin, applying a droplet of oil to the stubborn peg with precision that belied his large fingers, Franky found himself considering the instrument, another kind of vessel, this one for music rather than people or dreams. "You know," he said conversationally, "instruments and ships have a lot in common. Both need to be strong enough to withstand pressure, but flexible enough to resonate." Brooke nodded, his hollow eye sockets somehow conveying understanding. "Indeed, both require maintenance of their visible parts, but it's the invisible qualities that truly matter. A ship's spirit, an instrument's voice." Franky carefully tested the peg, now turning smoothly. "Tom used to say you could tell everything about a shipwright by listening to his hammering. Not just skill level, but heart." "Music and craftsmanship speak the same language," Brooke agreed. "The language of soul." Soul, such a simple word for something so complex. Franky had spent years rebuilding his physical form, replacing flesh with metal, bone with gears. Yet that intangible quality, soul, spirit, essential self, had remained constant throughout each transformation. What parts of yourself remain constant, no matter how your outer circumstances change? He returned the violin to Brooke, who tested it with a few experimental notes. The sound filled the workshop, hauntingly beautiful. Music from bone fingers, playing strings stretched over wood, creating something that transcended its physical components. "Perfect, Franky-san. You have my gratitude." Brooke bowed slightly. "Though I have no ears to hear with." "Yo-ho-ho-ho." Franky grinned at the familiar skull joke. "Anytime, bro." As Brooke turned to leave, he paused at the door. "May I ask what you're working on? Another weapon?" Franky shook his head. "Sensitivity upgrade. For feeling materials better." Something like understanding passed across Brooke's skeletal features. Ah, the invisible aspects of craftsmanship. After Brooke departed, Franky returned to his modification, but his mind lingered on their conversation. The visible and invisible, the tangible and intangible, the body and the soul. His cyborg form was perhaps the most visible aspect of his identity, impossible to ignore, distinctive enough to earn him a hefty bounty and immediate recognition. Yet it was the invisible qualities that defined him more truly: his loyalty, his creativity, his care for his nakama. The ship herself embodied this same duality. Visitors to the Thousand Sunny saw her unusual figurehead, her distinctive design, her impressive weapon systems, but her crew knew her invisible qualities, her reliability in storms, her surprising gentleness in calm waters, the feeling of homecoming whenever they returned to her decks after time ashore. Isn't it curious how often we focus on the visible aspects of ourselves and others, when the invisible qualities matter so much more? As night deepened and Franky continued his delicate work, he heard his crewmates returning, their voices carrying across the quiet harbor, footsteps on the gangplank, the familiar sounds of people coming home after an evening's adventure. Home, another concept that existed in both visible and invisible realms. The Sunny was home in her physical form, walls and decks, rooms and passages, But home was also the invisible bonds between crewmates, the shared history, the collective journey toward individual dreams. Franky carefully reassembled his forearm, testing the new sensitivity by running his fingers across different materials: wood, metal, fabric. Each texture registered with enhanced clarity, the modification successful. Super, he whispered, satisfaction warming him from within. Outside his workshop, the sounds of the ship settling for the night continued. Quiet conversations, doors opening and closing, Sanji in the galley, preparing a late snack for those who'd returned hungry from the tavern. What invisible qualities define your journey? What aspects of yourself transcend the physical form you inhabit? Franky powered down non-essential systems, preparing for his own rest cycle. Tomorrow, they would set sail again, continuing their journey toward Laugh-Tale and all that awaited them there. But tonight, in the quiet hours when day had surrendered to darkness, he found comfort in this truth, that for all his visible modifications and enhancements, it was the invisible aspects of his being that truly mattered: the craftsmanship of character, the architecture of relationships, the engineering of dreams. These were the blueprints that would outlast even his cybernetic body. Morning found the Thousand Sunny once again embracing the open sea, the island they'd visited shrinking to a smudge on the horizon before disappearing altogether. Franky stood at the ship's wheel, temporarily relieving Jinbei, while the fishman discussed navigation with Nami. His large hands held the wheel with practiced ease, making minor adjustments as the Sunny responded to his touch. There was something profoundly satisfying about guiding a vessel he'd created, feeling how theory had become reality, how blueprints had transformed into this living ship beneath his feet. The sea stretched endlessly before them, a canvas of possibility painted in blues and greens. Above, seagulls wheeled and called, occasionally swooping close to investigate the ship before returning to their aerial dance. She handles like a dream, Jinbei commented, returning to the helm. You've created something special, Franky. Pride warmed Franky's chest, but it was a different kind than the brash super confidence he often displayed. This was deeper, quieter, the satisfaction of craftsmanship recognized by someone who truly understood. Tom taught me the fundamentals, he said, surrendering the wheel to Jinbei's capable hands. Everything starts with a solid foundation. Have you ever paused to consider how much of what you create today began as lessons passed to you by others? As he moved away from the helm, Franky's eyes caught sight of Usopp on the lower deck, showing Chopper how to repair fishing nets. The sniper's hands moved with surprising dexterity, demonstrating knots and techniques while explaining each step clearly, passing knowledge forward, just as Tom had done for him and Iceberg, just as Franky himself now did for anyone in the crew interested in learning aspects of shipbuilding or mechanics. This inheritance of purpose, this continuation of wisdom through generations, seemed suddenly profound as Franky watched. Not just skills being transferred, but values, approaches, ways of seeing and being in the world. He thought about what he'd inherited from Tom beyond shipbuilding techniques. The belief that ships were more than transportation. They were freedom, made tangible. The understanding that craftsmanship was an expression of character. The knowledge that some things were worth protecting at any cost. These inheritances shaped not just what Franky built, but why he built it. What legacies of wisdom guide your hands? What inheritances of purpose shape your choices? Franky's thoughts were interrupted by Luffy's characteristic laughter. The captain had somehow entangled himself in Usopp's fishing line while attempting to help with the nets, resulting in a comical predicament that had Chopper rolling with giggles. The scene brought a smile to Franky's face. For all his incredible strength and indomitable will, Luffy maintained a childlike enthusiasm that infected everyone around him. Perhaps that, too, was a kind of inheritance. The gift of joy passed freely to all who journeyed with him. As the day progressed, Franky completed his regular maintenance checks on the ship's systems, but his mind continued exploring this thread of inheritance. He found himself wondering what aspects of himself might outlive his physical form, what knowledge, what values, what approaches to life might continue through those he influenced. Later, as afternoon mellowed toward evening, he discovered Robin in the library, surrounded by books about ancient shipbuilding techniques. "Find anything interesting?" he asked. Genuinely curious, she looked up with a slight smile. "Several things, actually. The Alabastan method of treating wood against desert heat might be useful if we encounter similar climates." Franky joined her at the table, examining diagrams in one of the open books. "Knowledge preserved across centuries," he mused. "Someone took the time to record these techniques so they wouldn't be lost." "Yes," Robin agreed. "A kind of immortality through information." The concept resonated with something Franky had been feeling all day. Tom used to say that every ship carries a piece of its builder's soul. I always thought he meant it figuratively, but now I'm not so sure. Robin considered this. Perhaps there's a kind of living on through what we create, not just in the physical object itself, but in how it influences others, how it changes the world in ways large and small. What will you leave behind? Not just possessions, but influences, ideas, ways of being that might continue long after you're gone. They discussed ancient shipbuilding further, Franky finding himself fascinated by how certain techniques had evolved while others remained essentially unchanged for centuries. This conversation of craftsmanship across time, builders separated by generations, but connected through shared purpose. As evening approached and Robin excused herself to join the others for dinner, Franky remained in the library, thoughtfully examining diagrams of ships long since returned to the sea. Each one represented not just a vessel, but a legacy. Knowledge passed forward, purposes inherited and transformed. He thought about the Thousand Sunny, the culmination of everything he'd learned from Tom, combined with his own innovation. She would outlast him, carrying the straw hats toward their dreams long after his cola engines eventually ran drowsy. But perhaps his true inheritance wasn't the ship itself, but what it enabled, the journeys it made possible, the dreams it carried forward, the lives it connected across vast oceans. And isn't that the nature of all meaningful inheritance? Not just objects or information passed from hand to hand, but purpose and possibility flowing from heart to heart. As stars began appearing in the evening sky, Franky made his way to the galley where his nakama had gathered for dinner. The familiar chaos greeted him. Luffy attempting to steal food, Sanji defending the ladies' portions, conversations overlapping like waves in a busy harbor. Taking his place among them, Franky felt a sudden swell of gratitude for this inheritance of connection, this family he'd found so unexpectedly after years of believing Tom's workers would be the only true family he'd ever know. We inherit not just skills and knowledge, but connections, ways of belonging that shape who we become. What connections have you inherited? What bonds have shaped your journey and continue to guide your course? Night had settled fully over the Thousand Sunny, stars scattered across the dark canvas of sky like blueprint markings on black paper. Most of the crew had retired to their quarters, but Franky remained in his workshop, putting final touches on the music box version of the Sunny he was creating for Brooke. The miniature ship was a marvel of tiny gears and delicate craftsmanship. When wound, the figurehead would turn, while a cylinder inside played Brooke's favorite song. Hours of precision work had gone into creating something that would bring joy to the skeleton musician who had spent 50 lonely years without music. As Franky worked, he found himself humming the tune Bink's Sake, the pirate song that connected past to present, linking crews across generations. Another form of inheritance, this one carried through melody rather than blueprints. The late hour brought a particular quality of silence, not complete stillness, for a ship at sea was never truly silent, but a gentle symphony of familiar sounds, the creak of wood adjusting to temperature changes, the soft lapping of waves against the hull, the distant flutter of sails catching midnight breezes, home sounds, the acoustic signature of the life he'd built. Have you ever noticed how the night brings clarity to thoughts that get lost in daylight's busy hours? Franky carefully closed the music box's hidden panel and wound the key. The miniature Sonny's figurehead began to turn as notes played, tiny but clear in the workshop's quiet. Perfect. Brooke would be surprised, not just by the gift itself, but by the fact that Franky had created something so delicate with his massive hands. Those hands, so different now from the human ones he'd been born with. Larger, stronger, capable of transforming into weapons or tools as needed, yet still his hands, still extensions of his will and creativity. Franky looked down at them, opening and closing metal fingers, considering all they had built and broken, protected, and transformed over the years. Hands were inheritance made visible, the skills they performed passed down from teacher to student, the objects they created becoming legacy. Tom's hands had built the Oro Jackson, the ship that carried the Pirate King to Laugh-Tale. Now, Franky's hands had built the Thousand Sunny, carrying perhaps the next Pirate King toward the same legendary island. Circles within circles, legacies connecting across time. What circles do your hands complete? What inheritances do they transform and pass forward? Franky carefully placed the finished music box on a shelf, ready to be presented at Brooke's birthday celebration tomorrow. Satisfaction warmed him from within, the particular joy of creation completed, of making something with purpose and care. He checked his internal cola levels, running low after the long day's work. From a refrigerated compartment, he extracted a fresh bottle, the familiar hissing sound as he opened it, bringing a smile to his face. Cola, such an ordinary drink, yet it powered all his extraordinary functions. There was a lesson in that somewhere, about how the most mundane things could enable the most marvelous outcomes when properly channeled. Perhaps that was true of life itself. The daily routines, the regular maintenance, the consistent small choices, these ordinary things creating the framework that supported dreams and adventures. The cola in the engine, the invisible force that enabled visible movement. As he refueled, Franky's thoughts drifted to Water 7, to Tom's workers, and the lessons learned there, to Iceberg, who had chosen to rebuild the city while Franky had chosen to sail away from it. Different paths, yet both honoring Tom's legacy in their own ways. We don't have to make the same choices as our teachers to honor their wisdom. Sometimes, the truest inheritance is finding our own way to embody the principles they lived by. The ship rocked gently, a soothing rhythm that had become as natural to Franky as his own heartbeat. Through the workshop window, he could see the moon's reflection on the water, a silver path stretching toward the horizon. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities for creation and protection. The journey toward Laugh-Tale continued one day at a time, one nautical mile after another, one adventure leading to the next. But tonight, in this quiet moment between one day's end and another's beginning, Franky found himself profoundly content with the life he had built. or perhaps more accurately, the life he had rebuilt from the wreckage of his original plans. Isn't that the greatest skill of all? Not just building according to blueprint, but adapting when storms destroy our carefully laid plans. Franky powered down non-essential systems, preparing for his rest cycle. His large frame settled into the specially reinforced chair he'd built for himself, comfort designed specifically for his unique body. As sleep began to claim him, his thoughts circled back to purpose and legacy, to the visible and invisible aspects of existence, to the balance between strength and sensitivity that defined his ongoing journey of self-creation. Tom had given him the foundation, the basic principles of shipbuilding, the understanding that ships were vessels of dreams. But Franky had built upon that foundation something uniquely his own, a cyborg body that defied convention, a ship that embodied freedom, a life dedicated to protecting his nakama and their collective journey. And what of your own journey? What foundations were given to you, and what unique structures have you built upon them? The workshop lamp dimmed automatically, programmed to conserve energy during sleep hours. In the gentle darkness, Franky's systems hummed quietly, not shutting down entirely, but entering a restful state where essential functions continued while others paused for maintenance and renewal. Not unlike the human condition, parts of us always active, maintaining life, while others rest and regenerate. The visible and invisible aspects of existence working in harmony. As consciousness faded, one final thought surfaced in Franky's mind, that perhaps the most super achievement wasn't building a perfect vessel, whether ship or body, but creating one resilient enough to adapt, sensitive enough to respond, strong enough to protect what matters most. A vessel worthy of the dreams it carried forward as moonlight bathes the thousand sunny in silver light. Remember this, dear listener. Sometimes our greatest strength lies not in what we build, but in how we rebuild after storms have passed. Franky's journey from human to cyborg, from vengeance to protection, reminds us that we are all works in progress, blueprints constantly being revised, vessels being refined for the dreams we carry. Sleep well, dream deeply, and know that somewhere on the endless sea, Franky and his nakama continue sailing toward tomorrow's dawn, until we meet again on these storytelling shores.